If body language roughly accounts for 70 to 80 of communication, what's one of the worst nonverbal insults you've ever received? Story 1. Someone said, "You look good today," to my friend. The man in line next to her looked her up and down, then shrugged. The laugh I really cackled from halfway across the bodega. This man lives rent-free in her head to this day. Story 2. I took a photo with a niche celebrity. We were both wearing suits. It was a formal event. His was much nicer than mine. We kinda bumped shoulders during the photo. I was walking away and saw him patting his shoulder. Oh, was I that dirty? The clothes I wore were brand new too. Story 3. I work in an office with about a dozen people, 2 of whom openly hate each other. We'll call them Chris and Rob. Chris' desk is sort of off to the side by the entrance to the warehouse with nobody else's desk around it. A couple of weeks ago, Rob was walking out to the warehouse. Chris was at his desk. When Rob passed by it, he stopped right in front, locked eye contact with Chris, lifted one leg and ripped a huge loud. That finished, he just resumed walking out to the warehouse without having said a word. I was across the office and watched the whole thing. Chris was visibly pissed. Story 4. Sat in a bus, not at my best of times, depressed and going through stuff. Somebody wanted to sit next to me, looks at me, looks like he saw a piece of or something like that and ran to the opposite side of the bus. Well, thanks for that. Story 5. When you're talking to somebody, and someone else comes up to talk to them, and they immediately shift to that conversation despite you being in mid-sentence. Story 6. My ex used to click his tongue while condescending me. Whenever I hear a tongue click now, I have to remind myself not everyone is doing it to be rude. Story 7. When I was a medical student, one of my rotations was to go to a particular department to work with someone there and see how they do their day-to-day work and learn from them. I was given no instructions except to go to a certain place at a certain time. When I got there, it was empty everywhere except for one woman who was working on her computer. I timidly walked up to her, briefly introduced myself, told her why I was there and what I was supposed to be doing, and asked if I was in the right spot or if she could direct me where I was supposed to be. She never looked up from her computer as I talked, glaring at her computer screen. Once I finished talking, she kept staring at her computer for an awkwardly long time while I stood there in silence, probably about 5 or 10 seconds. Finally she looked up from her computer, glaring at me with a look of pure disgust, raised her arms slightly in a "what the do you want" gesture, then shook her head slightly while scowling in an incredulous "where do these idiots come from" kind of way, then turned right back to her computer and started furiously typing away like she had been before I got there. I stood there for about 5 more seconds, then walked away and went home. I just skipped the entire 2-week rotation and ended up with a pass for the rotation L. Story 8. Went to give my 1-year-old baby a kiss and she stiff-armed me, repeatedly, all while her eyes were darting around the room looking for mama. She's 10 now and nothing changed. Story 9. My partner once gave me the wrap it up symbol with his hands. I had waited all day for him to be free of any distractions to tell him something that was important to me. I nearly cried, but I was too furious. Story 10. I have a friend who talks all the time. I listen all the time. It's rare for me to talk because I spend so much time listening. It's just how it is. I'm not complaining, however. One time I was telling her a rare story and she started a Facebook video in the middle of my story and gave her eye contact and attention to that video. She didn't notice I stopped telling the story. Story 11. Easily the look my dog is currently giving me for running out of peanut butter for her toy. She gets a little treat after breakfast and I forgot to get more. Story 12. I was talking to a friend when my throat did that thing where it just chokes randomly and I coughed a little, politely of course, turned and covered my face. It just did get a bit choky coffee, you know the one. Anyway, I turned back to seeing my friend have visible disgust on her face and recoiling. I don't know why, but something about it. I had a body malfunction and choked, and instead of concern she was grossed out. Story 13. I 32 mm 60 and 240 pounds. I was talking with a vice president at my company and a customer casually outside a conference room before a meeting began. We got on the topic of running and I shared that I had recently run a half marathon and my VP 50M, skinny guy, gave me the elevator eyes. In my mind I was like, you MFer, you think I'm too fat to run a half marathon, lol. Story 14. I work in printing and we had a sales rep come in to do a press check on a job. She was the owner's daughter, very attractive and no dummy. The press helper brought the job off the press and would not stop staring at her. He eventually walked up aside, apparently too close. She scrunched up her nose, sniffed the air and checked both her shoes for dog's hit. He backed right off and wouldn't look at her when she gave the approval. Story 15. Once was touring a school with my brother. I was maybe 14 at the time. I was there with my sister, my parents and younger brother. This woman who worked there looked at my sister and was like, "Wow, you're so gorgeous," and then looks over at me with an expression of pure shock and says nothing. I was like, I know I'm ugly, but was that really necessary? Story 16. A female manager at the mortgage company where I worked looked me up and down and gave me a look that told me she didn't like what I was wearing, as if I could afford new clothes on what they paid me. Story 17. Accidentally cut a guy off while driving. Instead of flipping me off, he gave me a thumbs down and shook his head like he was disappointed at me. That hurt way more. Story May 18th. Not be the worst, but as a black male, getting a jog in and a white woman will literally jump through thorny bushes in the middle of a block and cross the street with oncoming traffic. This has happened multiple times. One woman nearly caused an accident. I used to stop in bewilderment, because I thought they were reacting to a real threat like a rabid dog or running from someone attacking them, the visceral reaction is goofy. Story 19. When you're having a disagreement with a difficult person who knows they have no right and they get up to leave to force an end to the conversation, and you sit and make eye contact with them until they sit back down and let you finish. Only done it once, and I truly didn't even intend to. I was just so furious at this one manager who'd had it in for me for the full 4 years I'd worked there that I think all my resentment just culminated in that one power move. Small though it was, but my God did it work. The look on her face when she realized that for once I wasn't taking her. Story 20. When your friend group walks abreast and there isn't room for you next to them, so you tag along behind them. Thank God I left friendships like that in the dust by my late teens. Story 21. Involuntarily, as a ND person, whenever I talk about something that's passionate to me and I can see the person clearly stop listening midway and just start doing something else, it's rude. I know I tend to be a bit intense and go on for a bit, but they talk to me about their children, grandchildren, the weather, and other stuff that does not really matter to me. I listen to them not because I want to, but because I care about them and I respect them enough to know it's stuff they care about, and so I at least try to listen actively. So when I go into my own little speeches, don't just prop up your phone and do something else actively. At least have the decency to tell me it's not really something that is of interest to you, being dismissed by my mother, that narcissistic stare off into the distance whilst I'm trying to convey pain she caused. She's been doing it to me my entire life, and I just realized it wasn't me, it's her. Still hurts. Story 22. Playing with the phones while I'm talking, especially since I don't usually talk. But when I did, like sharing things and joke around, suddenly everyone on their phone, conversations that usually consisted 3 to 4 people ended or 2 of them starting their own new conversation while I'm still talking. That's basically slapped me in my face like saying you're boring and none of anything from your mouth matters. I guess being introverted is basically a sin in this world. Story 23. Every time this person talked to me she closed her eyes. Like she would open them when looking away, but every time she looked at me she closed her eyes. Like what? Story 24. This isn't the worst, but it's the first I thought of. I have very slight buck teeth, larger top front too, but I've never felt bad about them because I've always seen them as charming. It was New Year's Eve and I was solo bartending. It was insane. I had these 2 women hanging around angry at me because I had to cut them off. They were eating something and having some water, so I let them hang, but they were shooting me daggers. But whatever, I go out for a smoke and when I turn the corner, there they are, sipping a handle they've had in their coat or purse or whatever. That explains why they were so sloshed off like 2 drinks. They see me and I just shrug and head back in. Couple minutes later I hear knocking on the window. It's them, and they're going like this at me. It doesn't hit me what they're even doing, so I'm just staring like. They do this for probably close to 2 minutes until one of my regulars comes over and is like, "Oh, don't pay them any mind, sweetie. You're beautiful, we all love you." That made me realize they were mocking my teeth, lol. Story 25. I was driving in town and someone randomly gave me the finger. I was driving normal, I was waiting for a red light. When I drove through, someone going the other way just flipped me. I just smiled and waved back. Story 26. This isn't even that bad. But in high school there were a couple people in my classes that would just shoot me dirty looks all the time. I barely knew them and didn't even do anything to them, but they just look at me like they hated me or something. Story 27. The sadistic narcissist smirk possibly, and a couple of other smirks, or the "you're kinda weird" possibly freaking me out and not sure what to think look, which my occasionally dark humor sarcasm has occasionally caused, especially when people didn't realize I was being sarcastic. Then the worst, not directed at me but at the mention of someone or directed at someone else, is probably the look of utter disgust. Story 28. I once had a teacher I loathed put her hand on my shoulder when I was standing in front of the class. The second she took her hand off I brushed off my shoulder with a disgusted look. It wasn't intentional, I was just autistic and hated being touched in general. Story 29. Introduced my friend to a guy I knew he was a tool. Said guy openly wiped his hand on his jeans after shaking my friend's hand. There was nothing on her hand, it was just that she had a rock vibe and he was a straight-laced Jim that thought he was cool. What hurts my feelings when I'm talking and someone looks at their phone and immediately disengages. They want hear another word I say. Story 30. One of my uncles, who is my dad's brother, is one of those guys who is just full of really nice guy, but he's the type of guy who will want to show you a 5-minute YouTube video while you're standing right next to him. Just standing there watching the video waiting for it to end. Anyways, he likes to ramble a lot. My other uncle through marriage is the opposite of full of, no patience for BS, but he's also a bit of an, I once witnessed the first uncle try to tell him a story. About a minute and the second uncle just looked away and clearly stopped paying attention. One of those most awkward moments I've seen. I saved the day by being across the room and went with a "oh wow." Then what happened? I know the guy is annoying, but it was so rude and uncomfortable to witness. Story 31. One time my dog decided to get off the couch and go lay by himself on the floor, and it devastated me. He loves laying with his papa. Not sure why that happened that one time. Story 32. When I was in consulting I got to a meeting a few minutes late. Our project manager looked at me and then began typing. I already knew what was coming. Story 33. Young woman at my local bar who was a new regular, and seemed quite quiet and shy. I hoped to make her feel a bit more welcome, or at ease, and made a point of saying hello whenever I saw her. I'm 30F at the time. One time she came through the doors, which I was standing near. It's a tiny bar, and as we made eye contact I just said hey with a friendly smile. I've never seen someone literally throw their chin into the air in disgust. This girl upturned her face away from me so quickly. I thought she'd done damage. It was so cartoonish and melodramatic. After the initial WTF was that in my head, I shrugged and let it go. Some people don't want to be your friend, and that's fine. Funnily enough, it turns out she's been really off with loads of women at the bar, and then complains to the guys that she just can't seem to make any friends. Story 34. The sarcastic combo of raised brows, eyes looking downwards with a simultaneously surprised yet disgusted-looking smile if you unintentionally say something that shocks or offends them, usually happens when you have a difference of opinion or values, or due to your choice of wording. While it might be their reaction due to awkwardness, it sometimes comes off like appearing smugness, as if you've just fed into their preconceived narrative about you. The convo shutdowns down, they don't ask questions to clarify, no assumption that your intentions were good and no grace. Edit adjusted the wording because my first draft was half-baked and clearly some people felt some type of way about it. Also, clearly my word choices make people feel some type of way more often than I thought, and some people are just smug. Story 35. When someone you love and respect claimed they were just awkward and never gave eye contact, but gave their friend constant eye contact and naturally faced their body towards them while ignoring you. Story 36. I queued for 10 minutes at the information window at the Gare du Nord in Paris. When it was my turn, I asked the lady working there, in good French, at what time was the next train for Lyon and which platform was it going from. She looked at me, blinked a couple of times, then simply pulled down the blind on the window. Story 37. I had a person his teeth at me. I had no idea what this meant, and my friend who was with me, Jamaican, just went off on the guy. I was just standing there confused that anything had even happened. He later explained it was a very rude gesture in the Caribbean. Story 38. I'm autistic, but too intelligent and observant for my own good. For me, it's the micro-expression of contempt, the half-second lip curl, when I start talking about something I'm passionate about, and it registers that I'm autistic, that lets me know that they think they're better than me. Story 39. There's so many ways nonverbal gestures can insult a person, so I can't really narrow it down, but I will say it's annoying when someone snaps their fingers or whistles at you to get your attention. I straight ignore it. Oh, you want my attention? You're definitely not gonna get it by treating me like a dog. Cool, good talk. Story 40. I look insane, generally look real dirty. The most recent instance was walking into the agency I volunteer at. We are a harm reduction agency that does needle exchange and etc. Right next door is a more high-end private therapy practice. I'm not a current substance user, but based on stereotypes PPL hold, I look like one. I was walking in as some yoga instructor lady walked out. She did the instinctual half smile but then immediately stopped in her tracks, and the smile turned to a cringe as her brain started processing my appearance. Realizing that I was walking into the agency next door, it was literally like a nonverbal hi you, a junkie. Cracked me up so hard. Also, I'm just glad she did it to me and not one of our participants. Stigma sucks. That look on her face when I said she was fun and should kick it sometime. There were no words exchanged. Just that look, it haunts me. Story 41. When I'm driving and encounter other bad drivers, I give them a thumbs down. People seem to hate it, more than being given the middle finger. I've had people I've given the thumb to catch up with me at red lights and start tripping. This one cab driver tried yelling at me while he was driving. It's very funny. Story 42. When I was working my first job at a certain 3-letter package delivery service, I was being bullied and harassed constantly by my coworkers and especially my supervisors. I was 19, it was my second real job ever, and they absolutely hated me. I was a good worker, showed up on time, but they loved to push me around and talk such nasty and little petty power plays to bully me, etc. I remember I was waiting to be assigned, and one of the people I considered friendly walked around the corner. I smiled and went to approach to say hi, and they very obviously rolled their eyes when they saw me, heavy head roll and subtle falling of the shoulders, like my very existence was a burden. So I literally halted in my tracks, nodded and said a quiet hey, and avoided that dude like the plague 6 years later, and that was one of the things that stung the most at this job. I was physically and financially threatened repeatedly, lies constantly told about me. They made an entire false case to prevent me from being promoted to full-time was part-time. They all really just hated me. All feelings mutual TBH. They all can eat. Story 43. I had arranged to spend an hour with a lady of the night. Day in this case knocked on her apartment door. She opened it with a smile which immediately disappeared. Shoulders sunk and eyes rolled, and she just motioned me in with a heavy sigh and slammed the door behind us. In retrospect, I should have walked away. Story 44. I was at a bar with my friends and the guy I was dating, and there was a 70s 80s rock cover band playing. While performing Fat-Bottomed Girls, the lead singer went into the crowd and started giving women's butts a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Gross, I know. He gets to me, does this little look over at my, and laughs and shakes his head while giving me 2 thumbs down. This is partly the reason why I started weightlifting. Story 45. I applied at a hair salon once. I'm a fairly down-to-earth person, dressed professionally but not high fashion. When I handed my resume to the senior hairdresser, some bubblegum chewing lady with a fancy updo, maybe in her early 30s, she took it, looked me in the eyes, then lowered her gaze to my feet, then back to my eyes again, like she was judging my appearance, before popping a gum bubble and saying okay, and shoved the resume under the front counter. I do not miss that line of work, people 18 to 50 all acting like high schoolers. Story 46. I went on a group trip with my siblings. The topic of my father's horrible behavior was a big topic of conversation. As usual, at one point I went back downstairs to get some reheated leftovers. Sister and brother were trash-talking Dad. When my sister stopped telling a story about him, I started telling a similar one. She turned and looked at me, rolled her eyes, and turned back to brother to start a new horrible story about him. It was far from the first nonverbal rejection of the trip. I was so excited to go on this trip, but it was just reminder after reminder that he'll always be the annoying baby sister trying to be a part of the group, even at 31. Story 47. Someone who was stood whilst I was sat, a manager, stared at me for a longer than appropriate amount of time. Being the introvert I am and not knowing what to say, I awkwardly said, "Why are we looking at each other? Do you want me to say something?" She then walked away and my rather lovely boss indicated I'd probably said something wrong, so I awkwardly apologized for being standoffish. She was the deputy head teacher of the school I work at, and no one likes her at all. Story 48. I get immediately irritated when I'm trying to get from point A to point B without being noticed. I don't want to interact with someone or don't have the energy to be trapped by a long-winded talker, and someone who sees that I am trying to be quick and quiet and go unseen calls attention to me. I hate it. Leave me alone. I obviously don't want Gobi here. Story 49. A story from school. We were about 13 years old. We were asked to move seats by the teacher, so we had to take our things and move. The girl whose place I was taking had left her pencil case there and asked me to hand it over to her. I did. She grabbed it with only the thumb and index as if it was a poopy diaper and made a disgusted face. She then laughed it off with her friend next to her. I was the lonely, friendless kid back then, and this only made me hurt even more. I wasn't dirty, but had really bad acne is all I could think of to explain this. Story 50. Not me, but years ago a friend had some CDs stolen from their car, but not all of them. Whoever broke in took the time to browse her CD case and in essence judge her musical taste. She said she'd be less mad if they took them all. Story 51. Guy walked up to me at a professional conference, looked me up and down really slowly with a look of disdain on his face, and said, "Oh, it's you." I had met him precisely once before this interaction. Our profession is very intertwined though, and I ended up working with him a couple of years later. Turns out, he's just a real weird dude. I think he was making a joke. Story 52. Oh boy, I made a very bad social faux pas during a convention I was at. I was hoping to speak to the creator of a series I work on and chose a very bad time to do it. They were, I assume, trying to get from one place to another in a clandestine way, and my friend, in an attempt to bolster my confidence, grabbed my hand and jogged after them. We caught up, he introduced me, and the creator shot me with possibly the coldest, most disgusted expression I've ever been lit up with, stopped me dead in my tracks. Brain rebooted and I literally ran away. Heartbreaking for me at the time, but after reflection and a bit of distance, I can absolutely admit I was in the wrong. Story 53. When someone tilts their head forward doing that triple chin, raising their eyebrows and opening their eyes wide, pursing lips, to another person when you give an honest opinion. Story 54. An old boss used to push back his roller chair and put his stupid feet up on the desk every time I came to talk to him, literally pointing the soles of his filthy shoes at me while I tried to communicate with him. I hope he got foot cancer. Story 55. One of my aunts pulled my parents and I aside to talk with us outside in the backyard at a family gathering. She was trying to give us an intervention because she thought we weren't doing enough to prepare for my grandma's funeral service. My mom has a mental illness and my grandma's death was very hard on her. According to my aunt, my mom was just being lazy. While my dad was defending my mom, I noticed my other aunt at a window glaring at us from inside. When she saw me staring, she shut the curtains so fast. I could tell she was upset with us and it really hurt because both of my aunts didn't understand my mom. Everyone grieves differently. Story 56. When I went down to kiss my girl who was sitting and she immediately recoiled, pulling her head back, like I was trying to ask her to smell my dirty gym shoe. That was the first sign I knew it was over. Story 58. When you're having a conversation with someone and when it's their turn to reply, they're just on their phone reading something, even though they were just speaking with you 5 seconds ago. Story 59. My husband and I were invited to his cousin's wedding. His cousin's mom is but I try to play nice. I went in for a hug and she rejected it. It's still kind of smarts, you Cindy. Someone once checked the time mid-conversation while I was talking. Not even a sneaky glance, full wrist turn, dramatic sigh, like I was a boring lecture they couldn't escape. Story 60. When you approach a group chatting and you join in only for no one to look at you or engage with you, instead, they just keep talking like you didn't just join in and try to conversate with them. Story 61. Just that feeling of betrayal to your face. I think that's the worst, acting nice and friendly but you can just feel the deception, waiting and digging for things, trying to make you say things so they can take them out of context and make out you mean something else and bring problems to you for no good reason. Story 62. I was one time in a hearing room watching a regulatory proceeding. One of the lawyers didn't like what the commission chair was saying to him, turned his back to the commission chair, basically the highest ranking person in the room, and walked away. This would be the same as a lawyer turning around on a judge in a legal proceeding. He was swiftly kicked out of the room, although he is still practicing in that jurisdiction, which always surprises me when I see his name come up. It was my first time in a hearing room and still, 15 years later, the most drama I have ever seen in a regulatory proceeding. Story 63. A doctor looking me up and down before refusing me a surgery, even before looking at my chart. Never felt more insulted by a doctor, and that says a lot since as a fat kid I got insulted a lot by them. Story 64. Told my teenager we were going to dinner for my birthday. He stared at me and then picked up his phone to respond by texting me. It turned out to be a joke, and I laugh about it in retrospect. but in the moment, yeah, that hurt. Story 65. When I was beefing with a friend, but I was the only one trying to work through our problems in a mature manner, while she rolled her eyes, scoffed, and picked at her jeans while clearly not listening to a word I was saying. Story 66. I read this one from the internet a while ago and I've started doing it since. When you're driving and someone cuts you off, instead of flipping them off you just give them a thumbs up. I think it conveys more. Story 67. The new VP had a first meeting with my director and I. We entered the room, he shook my director's hand and when it came to me, I pulled my hand out, he looked at me and just turned around. That died from a heart attack 5 years ago. I can't say I was very sad about it, he was a bad person in general. Haha, not solely because of that handshake snobism. Story 68. I accidentally cut someone off one time. They sped up and passed me. While we were next to each other, dude looks over and gives me a thumbs down and then passed me. I think about it pretty much daily. Story 69. I was flyering for my university student union elections. I tried to hand a flyer to someone and he looked at it, looked me up and down, and just shook his head slowly and walked away. Devastating. Story 70. Not received. Accidentally given. Our physics teacher was going through star decay with us and he made a claim that surprised me. I looked at him, he stormed out. Story 71. A professor in college giving me a side eye and walking away from me when I asked for feedback on the garment I made. She was really mean and was not capable of constructive criticism. Story 72. When I was in 6th grade there was a clique of girls that would usually travel in a group of 3 to 6, and if they were around someone they didn't like, they'd start coughing around them. They told me it was to act as if the person had literal cooties. Sometimes they would completely shun people, and do the whole I think I just felt a cold breeze, I thought I heard something. Did you act? Being shunned is awful, but it hurt my feelings when they all coughed around me too. Story 73. I have a few, and most of them came from my middle school gym class. I was an extremely awkward child, autistic, although I didn't know it at the time and as such, didn't have any friends. I remember the looks of disgust and disappointment on my classmates' faces every time they thought they would get to pair up with one of their friends only to be stuck with me instead. I remember getting hit in dodgeball and going to sit on the sidelines, and the other kids piling their jackets up in a wall so that I couldn't sit next to them. Story 74. Prior to my divorce I was driving with my wife and just laid my hand on her leg. She moved it off. It crushed my soul and almost 3 years later I still think about it. Story 75. I had a basset hound who was an outdoor dog. It was a dark cold winter evening and I was taking leftover chicken out to the dog. Too lazy to get a flashlight, I just walked to the pen, and used my foot to feel where his food dish was. I dumped the chicken into the dish and heard a splash. I go back to the house to get a flashlight so I could see to get fresh water for the dog. When I walked back to the pen, I saw the basset with his nose underwater, basically bobbing for chicken. The look he gave me was the meanest, nastiest, most pissed off look I have ever gotten. Just keep staring at their hair with occasional looking behind them like someone is approaching. They will immediately notice you're not paying attention. Stop talking and feel threatened for the possibility of having someone behind. Works 100 of the time. Story 76. When my ex was in the process of finding reasons to terminate our 6-year relationship, I came home from work one day, and she didn't even turn from her computer to say hello, then got mad at me for not interrupting whatever she was doing to tell her I wanted her to acknowledge my existence. Story 77. We were eating and I ate something really spicy I wasn't expected and coughed a bit. My kids were super concerned and my wife looked at me with sheer contempt. Story 78. I was once at a social event and for some reason, this girl was going down the line and giving people high fives. When she got to me, she suddenly had this visible look of pure disgust as she curled her fingers and walked away. Story 79. A middle-aged man shaking his head at me like a disappointed father, because his truck hit my car because he couldn't be bothered to check before switching lanes. Story 80. I know someone who has an unfortunate unconscious facial expression. She will randomly show slight disgust, and it's at random times. I often wonder how she has solid relationships when she's showing disgust with them. Story 81. I studied body language through the Navarro Foundation. During a job interview I asked an employer how he supports his staff and he showed 4 immediate signs of high discomfort. Normally 2 is worthy of note. I later found he was just cruising along for retirement and had mentally checked out from work. Story 82. Women always look at me as if I have some sort of deformity. 1 second they laugh, then the moment they lay eyes on me they look like I just ruined their entire day. Story 83. I have a fade and brightly colored hair, which the aunties of Latin America do not appreciate on someone they perceived as a woman. On a walk with my white partner after dinner a couple nights ago, I caught one staring from a table outside a neighborhood bar. I gave her a big smile and a buenos trades and just got both eyebrows raised back. Story 84. Cannot remember what the argument was, but my boyfriend made his fingers into an X and frowned at me. I felt genuinely disrespected and couldn't stop laughing.